This is complete and utter madness. I can't wrap my head around this, right? It's nuts. So we go through all this thing of where do the blood references come from. The blood references are nonsense. They change over time. The population gets sicker. The blood references get worse. The doctors swoop in and change what the new normal is and change the status quo. America has no idea what healthy is. No clue. And then that brings us to the real topic at hand, which is COVID-19. We got there, everybody. We arrived. We're going to talk about COVID, okay? So let's go. Now, COVID-19 risk factors. If you look at all of the places where we see higher than average per capita COVID-19 death rates, they are all hotspots of chronic metabolic disease, including hypertension and diabetes. Both are almost directly correlated with the number of obese individuals in those populations. So if you have a population that has a lot of obesity, a high prevalence of obesity in this certain population, there is assuredly going to be a high level of hypertension and type 2 diabetes in that same population, period. That's the way that it goes, right? Now, we have something that we didn't have prior to this AMA episode tonight. The entire reason why I decided to create yet another coronavirus episode is because we now have the largest US study of COVID-19. And the title of this study, if you want to Google it, is Factors Associated with Hospitalization and Critical Illness Among 4,103 Patients with COVID-19 in New York City. Obviously, I'm not going to write that on the whiteboard, right? So you can Google that. Factors associated with hospitalization and critical illness among 4,103 patients with COVID-19 in New York City. Again, the largest U.S. study of COVID-19 to date. Now, I'm going to tell you the risk factors. And then we're really going to break this down because the top one I don't even think is the real top. I'll explain, okay? So the number one risk factor is age. Being older than 65. That's the number one risk factor for required hospitalization, okay? The number two risk factor is obesity. So the number one risk factor is not actually a chronic condition. So we kind of take that off the board. Yeah, sure, okay, age is the biggest risk factor. But if we're talking about things that are controllable, meaning chronic conditions, okay? Chronic conditions, the number one chronic condition is obviously obesity. Now, what's crazy here is we're not talking about hypertension, we're not talking about diabetes, we're not even talking about previous lung conditions. Just run-of-the-mill obesity, all right? This is the number one risk factor for required hospitalization from COVID-19. Now, I need you to understand the severity of this, so I'm going to include quotes from this study. Listen very carefully. Quote, for hospital admission, the most important feature was age, above 65, followed by obesity. It is notable that the chronic condition with the strongest association with critical illness was obesity, with a substantially higher odds ratio than any cardiovascular or pulmonary disease. End quote. What? Let me repeat that for you because this is very, very important. You need to listen to what I just said and you need to let it sink in, okay? Second part of that quote, let this sink in. Quote, it is notable that the chronic condition with the strongest association with critical illness was obesity, with a substantially higher odds ratio than any cardiovascular or pulmonary disease. End quote. What? For the respiratory illness, COVID-19, obesity is a higher risk factor for severe complications than pre-existing lung conditions. What? And people want to argue with me that metabolic health is not the number one issue right now. What are you talking about? Literally, the study shows that obesity puts you at a higher risk of death from COVID-19 than previous lung conditions. That's how bad it is to be obese right now. Metabolic disease is that powerful, okay? Let's break this down even further. The reason why I say I don't think this is legit and I think this is super legit is because we know that the number one risk factor for required hospitalization and complications is being over age 65. Well, guess what? In America, people over the age of 65, a full 30% of them are obese. Number one risk factor, being over the age of 65. Number two risk factor, obesity, the number one chronic condition. And in America, over 30% of all 65-year-olds are obese. Wait a second. Do we have any third graders to connect the dots for us here? Can we please do this? Somebody bring in a gang of third graders so we can sort this thing out. Better than the scientists that stand up on CNN. Now, what I'm saying is 30% of people are not just overweight, over age 65, they're obese. That is at least a full 30 pounds or more overweight. On top of this, I'm going to give you a crazy statistic. Did you know that obese individuals over the age of 55 in America have hands down the highest average expense per year for medical care for their pre-existing conditions at over $7,000 per person per year? $7,000. That's the average. That is the average for obese individuals over the age of 55. So more people added in there. But over $7,000 mean expenses per year for obese individuals over the age of 55. Did somebody say comorbidities, everybody? Did somebody say comorbidities? Could it be that part of the reason age is the number one risk factor is actually tied to the fact that obesity is quite prevalent, the number one chronic condition is quite prevalent in this same population of individuals who are at the highest risk? What are we doing? I certainly think that there's a connection there, but what the hell do I know, everybody? I've only been telling you this for over a month now. It seems weird, right? I'm crazy. Well, forget it. Don't worry. Let's continue, all right? I'm not done yet, and I got time. I'm happy. Let's keep going. So, other factors. We talked about diabetes, hypertension, obesity, right? All these things. Michelle's talking about it now. And Michelle's in the front line. She's an ICU nurse, right? So diabetes, hypertension, gout. So she's saying in Monterey County, the age is reversed. We had very few cases over 65, and most were in the age group 45 to 65. Obese, diabetic, and hypertension. Who would have thunk it? What are you talking about? No, that can't be possible, right? Okay, all the statistics point to it. It's quite simple. But anyway, let's dig in. So diabetes, hypertension, obesity, and another one that people aren't talking much about is gout. All of these things point directly to insulin resistance, right? All of this. Insulin resistance. 88% of the population has some level of insulin resistance. What we haven't talked about yet on a CLOVIS podcast is that insulin signals in all immune system cells and tells them how to function. Insulin literally mediates the immune system response in the body. It's that important. If a human being is insulin resistant, it is likely that their immune cells are also insulin resistant. Now, I taught you this, I did an AMA called Hormones Finding the Balance, and I explained to you that what hormone resistance is, like insulin resistance in type 2 diabetes, is basically you have two iPhones, right? You have an insulin, a hormone, right? So there's an organ over here. That organ is spitting out a hormone, right? And that hormone needs to go here to the receptor. This is all in AMA, I don't know what number it is, but Hormones Finding the Balance. Now, what happens, if you've ever been in a concert or something and turned your phone into airplane mode, well, this person over here is trying to text you, and the text doesn't go through because you're in airplane mode, right? So this phone's in airplane mode, it's not getting the signal. It is not getting the signal sent from the organ. This hormone is not hitting the receptor. The receptor doesn't hear the signal and can't respond accordingly. This is what happens in situations like insulin resistance. The receptor is not getting the signal, okay? So insulin resistance in COVID can be terribly bad because the immune system cells are not getting the signal that they need to get from insulin because you're insulin resistant, so you don't respond properly. Literally, it signals T cells, all the immune cells in the body, during bouts of inflammation and, yes, infection, They receive signals from insulin to do their job. And if they can't receive the signal, they're not going to respond appropriately. Okay? It's crazy, right? This is the same reason why immune suppressing drugs are so bad right now. They're talking about this, like people with lupus, let's say, are at a tremendous risk right now. Because in my world, somebody comes to me with lupus, we go on an extreme elimination diet, and we remove all the inflammatory triggers, and we try to correct this condition by dealing with the root cause. Mainstream medical doesn't do that. They say, oh, you have lupus, you have an overreactive immune system. We're not going to worry about where all of that systemic inflammation is coming from. We're going to give you a pharmaceutical drug to suppress your immune system. Wow, that's a bad idea, and that's what they do. So now we have people running around on these immune system suppressing drugs at a time of a global pandemic. This is very, very scary, okay? Very, very scary. So I'm sure you can see how dangerous this is in the face of COVID. Now, I'm going to take this even farther, okay? So we talked about the overall risk factors associated with metabolic health. We've now talked about the poor reference ranges. We've now talked about insulin resistance role in the immune system, how big of a problem that can be. We're covering a lot of ground tonight. Now we're going to go deeper because we have even more data that we didn't have over a month ago when I made my first piece of coronavirus content. So let's dig in. Here we go.